Something just happened in Texas that should not be possible. The ground shook in a state that most Americans do not associate with earthquakes. Not California, not the Pacific Northwest, not Alaska, Texas, and not along some obscure rural stretch of empty desert where nobody would notice. It shook beneath one of the most densely populated and economically critical regions in the entire United States. The seismometers lit up. The USGS alert fired. And within minutes, scientists who study induced seismicity were staring at data that confirmed what they have been warning about for years, that Texas has been quietly turning itself into one of the most seismically active states in the nation, and that the industry responsible for it has been allowed to continue operating with almost no meaningful restriction. What just happened in Texas is not a natural disaster, it is a man-made one. And the part that should terrify every person living in the affected region is not what already happened. It is what the scientists who study this are saying comes next. Because what comes next, based on everything the data now shows, is not smaller, it is larger. And the communities sitting above these reactivated faults were built with zero, not minimal, zero, consideration for what happens when the ground beneath them moves. Before we break down exactly what struck, where it struck, and why the location is so alarming, I want to ask you something directly. If you live in Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Midland, Odessa, Abilene, Lubbock, San Antonio, anywhere in the state, did you feel it? Did the windows rattle in a way you could not explain? Did the walls creak in a way that woke you up and made no sense for the time of day? Drop your city in the comments right now and tell me exactly what you experienced. People across Texas need to hear from each other right now. And if you're not in Texas, but you want to understand the seismic risk that is building beneath American cities and towns that were never designed to handle earthquakes, subscribe right now. It is completely free. This channel exists to give you the science before the crisis arrives, not after it. Hit the like button too, because it tells the algorithm that people need to see this information. Now let us get into exactly what happened, why the location matters more than the magnitude, and what the scientists monitoring this situation are saying tonight. Texas was not always an earthquake state. For most of recorded American history, Texas was seismically quiet in a way that geologists found entirely unremarkable. The state sits in the interior of the North American plate, far from the active plate boundaries along the west coast, where the country's most powerful naturally occurring earthquakes originate. The ancient rock underlying Texas had been geologically stable for hundreds of millions of years. The faults that exist beneath the state, and there are many, formed during ancient episodes of continental rifting and collision, were considered dormant, locked, geologically inert in any human-relevant time frame. Scientists who studied them did not treat them as a meaningful hazard because they showed no evidence of recent movement and no signs of accumulating stress from active tectonic forces. The National Seismic Hazard Maps published by USGS in the 1990s showed most of Texas as a zone of very low seismic hazard. Buildings were not designed for earthquakes. Emergency management plans did not prioritize seismic response. Insurance companies did not price earthquake risk into Texas policies the way they priced it in California. The possibility of a damaging earthquake in Texas was not a serious topic in scientific literature or public policy. It was not even a hypothetical worth modeling. Then the oil and gas industry discovered hydraulic fracturing at industrial scale, and everything changed. The connection between oil and gas operations and induced seismicity is no longer scientifically controversial. It is one of the most thoroughly documented and replicated findings in modern geophysics, supported by thousands of peer-reviewed studies across multiple countries and geological settings, confirmed explicitly by USGS in multiple public hazard assessments, and acknowledged by the industry itself in legal proceedings across multiple states. The mechanism is not complicated, and it does not require any exotic geology to operate. When large volumes of wastewater, the highly saline water that comes up from deep underground formations, along with oil and gas during extraction, are injected back into disposal wells deep in the earth, that fluid migrates through the pore spaces of the rock and eventually reaches ancient fault zones. When pressurized fluid reaches a fault that is already under stress, even a fault that has been completely dormant for tens of millions of years, it reduces the friction holding the two sides of the fault in contact. Think of it this way. Imagine two rough surfaces pressed tightly together by enormous force. That friction is what keeps the fault locked. Now imagine pumping water between those two surfaces under pressure. The water does not push the surfaces apart. It simply reduces the friction between them. And a fault that was held in place by friction, suddenly with less friction, moves. Sometimes that movement is a microseism, barely detectable by sensitive instruments. Sometimes it is a magnitude 3 that rattles dishes. And increasingly, as injection volumes have grown to unprecedented levels and the practice has expanded across wider geographic areas, it is producing earthquakes that damage buildings and injure people. Oklahoma documented this process more dramatically than any other state in the nation, and the Oklahoma story is the one that every policymaker in Texas should have memorized by now. In 2008, Oklahoma averaged roughly 1 magnitude 3, 0, or greater earthquake per year. That number was consistent with the state's background seismicity rate, and nobody found it alarming. By 2015, after years of rapid expansion in wastewater disposal injection following the shale oil and gas boom that swept across the state, Oklahoma was experiencing over 900 magnitude 3, 0 or greater earthquakes per year. Not 9, not 90, 900. More than California in the same period, more than any other state in the contiguous United States. More earthquakes in a single year than Oklahoma had experienced in the entire previous century of recorded seismic history. The Prague earthquake of 2011, a magnitude 5. 6, that injured 2 people, destroyed 14 homes, and damaged a historic dam, was linked by multiple independent scientific studies to nearby disposal wells. The Pawnee earthquake of 2016, a magnitude 5. 8, that became the largest ever recorded in Oklahoma, prompted the state government to order emergency shutdowns of multiple disposal wells in the surrounding area. Oklahoma eventually implemented a comprehensive traffic light protocol for injection operations, a science-based regulatory framework that required operators to reduce or halt injection whenever seismicity in a given area exceeded specified thresholds. Earthquake rates in Oklahoma declined measurably and significantly after those protocols were implemented. The lesson was unambiguous. The earthquakes were not random. They were a consequence of specific industrial decisions. Change the decisions and you change the earthquake rate. Continue the decisions and the earthquakes continue and escalate. Texas has been making the same decisions Oklahoma made, and it has been making them at a scale that dwarfs even Oklahoma's peak. The Permian Basin, straddling the Texas-New Mexico border in the western part of the state, is one of the most productive oil and gas regions on the planet. Its output rivals that of some of the world's largest oil-producing nations. The volumes of produced water, the wastewater that comes up alongside oil and gas generated by Permian Basin operations, are staggering in a way that requires specific numbers to convey. Texas operators inject billions of barrels of produced water into disposal wells every year. The Permian Basin alone accounts for a substantial fraction of all produced water disposal in the United States. Those injection volumes have been growing year over year as production has expanded, and the geological formations beneath the Permian Basin, which include ancient fault systems associated with the Ouachita Structural Belt, the Marathon Uplift, and the Anadarko Basin extension, have been responding to that injection in exactly the way Oklahoma's faults responded, with earthquakes. The seismicity in the Permian Basin has increased dramatically over the past decade. Areas that recorded essentially zero seismic activity before 2010 are now recording multiple earthquakes per week. Some of those earthquakes have exceeded a magnitude 5. 0, large enough to cause structural damage to buildings not designed for seismic loading, which is essentially every building in the region, because nobody in Texas built to earthquake standards in a state that was never supposed to shake. What just happened adds a specific and deeply alarming data point to that already serious picture. The location of this earthquake matters more than its magnitude. The area where the ground moved sits in a region with substantial residential population, with schools, hospitals, and commercial buildings constructed under building codes that assumed zero seismic hazard, and with critical infrastructure, serving not just local communities, but broader regional economic functions. When structural engineers talk about earthquake vulnerability, the metric that matters most is not the magnitude of the earthquake. It is the relationship between the ground motion the earthquake produces and the ground motion the building was designed to resist. A magnitude 4. 5 earthquake in Los Angeles, striking a region where modern seismic building codes have been enforced for decades, typically produces minor damage in newer construction and moderate damage in older unreinforced buildings. The same magnitude 4. 5 earthquakes striking a Texas community where no building has any seismic design whatsoever can produce significantly more damage, because every structure in the area is operating outside its design envelope the moment the ground starts moving. USGS has documented and quantified this asymmetry in its induced seismicity research. The central and eastern United States, precisely because of its historically low seismicity and therefore its lack of seismic building codes, suffers disproportionately more damage per unit of ground motion than the West Coast. Texas is the largest, most populous, and most economically consequential state in that vulnerable zone. The depth of this earthquake matters too. Naturally occurring tectonic earthquakes in the stable interior of the North American plate tend to occur at depths of 10 to 20 kilometers or more, where the rock is under enormous confining pressure and where the seismic energy has a long path through the earth before it reaches the surface, losing intensity along the way. Induced seismic events associated with disposal well injection tend to occur at much shallower depths, typically 3 to 8 kilometers, because that is where the injected fluid is migrating, and where the fault segments it is pressurizing are located. Shallow earthquakes produce stronger surface shaking than deep earthquakes of the same magnitude. This is basic seismology. The energy travels a shorter distance and arrives at the surface more concentrated. It is the difference between a punch that travels 12 inches and one that travels 3 inches. The shorter one lands harder. The shallowness of induced seismic events is one of the primary reasons researchers emphasize that magnitude alone is not an adequate metric for assessing the hazard they represent. A magnitude 4, 8, induced earthquake at 4 kilometers depth in a Texas town full of unreinforced buildings can produce damage that a magnitude 5. 5 natural tectonic earthquake at 15 kilometers depth in California would not approach. The regulatory situation in Texas is where the story becomes explicitly about policy choices rather than geological inevitability. The Railroad Commission of Texas, which despite its name is the agency that regulates the state's oil and gas industry, a historical artifact of the era when railroads and pipelines were regulated together, has authority over disposal well operations. It has used that authority selectively. In specific cases where seismicity near a particular well has been dramatic enough to generate public attention and political pressure, the Commission has ordered reductions in injection rates or well shutdowns. But Texas has not implemented anything resembling the comprehensive, systematic, science-based regulatory framework that Oklahoma developed after its earthquake crisis. There are no mandatory seismicity thresholds that automatically trigger industry-wide injection reductions across a region experiencing elevated earthquake activity. There is no requirement that operators conduct detailed fault characterization studies before siting new disposal wells to determine whether the proposed location is near potentially active fault segments. There is no real-time monitoring requirement that connects seismicity data to injection operations in a way that allows rapid regulatory response before a damaging earthquake occurs. The framework that exists is reactive and case-by-case rather than proactive and systematic. And the economic and political weight of the oil and gas industry in Texas, an industry that generates tens of billions of dollars in state tax revenue, employs hundreds of thousands of workers, and has been a central feature of Texas' political and economic identity for over a century, creates structural conditions within the regulatory process that make comprehensive reform politically difficult in ways that independent researchers and public health advocates have documented extensively. The communities most directly exposed to the consequences of this regulatory gap are not the gleaming towers of downtown Dallas or the medical complex of Houston. They are the smaller cities and towns of West Texas and the surrounding region where disposal well operations are most concentrated. Midland and Odessa, the twin cities at the economic heart of the Permian Basin, have experienced years of elevated seismicity. Big Spring, Pecos, Andrews, Seminole, communities whose entire economic existence is organized around the oil and gas industry that is simultaneously producing the seismicity threatening their buildings, have building stocks that reflect the rapid, economically driven construction of oil boom eras. Mobile homes and manufactured housing units, which house a substantial fraction of the oil field workforce and their families, are among the most vulnerable structure types to earthquake shaking because they are not anchored to foundations in ways that resist lateral seismic forces. Older commercial buildings along the main streets of these communities, unreinforced masonry construction that was the standard commercial building type across the American interior for most of the 20th century, perform catastrophically in earthquakes. They are the building type that killed people in Oklahoma. They are everywhere in West Texas. The hospital situation in the affected region deserves particular attention because it represents a compounding vulnerability that emergency planners have not adequately addressed. Regional hospitals in West Texas were not designed for seismic loading. Their structural systems, their utility connections, their medical gas lines, and their equipment mounting systems all reflect the assumption of a non-seismic environment. In a significant earthquake, these facilities face potential structural damage, equipment failures, and utility disruptions at precisely the moment they are needed most. The trauma care capacity of the broader West Texas region is already limited relative to population because of the distances involved and the economics of rural healthcare. A significant seismic event that simultaneously generates mass casualties and degrades the hospital infrastructure, meant to treat those casualties, creates a compounding crisis that regional emergency management systems are not resourced to handle. This is not speculation about a distant hypothetical. It is a gap that emergency managers in the region have identified and documented. The resources to close it have not been allocated. There is a longer-term geological concern that the research literature has been raising with increasing urgency, and that the public discussion of Texas-induced seismicity has not yet fully incorporated. The question is not just whether individual injection operations can trigger individual earthquakes on local fault segments. The question, the one that keeps researchers awake, is whether sustained high-volume injection across a broad region can alter the stress state of the larger fault network in ways that increase the probability of a significantly larger earthquake on a major fault structure. In Oklahoma, this question was largely academic because the state's largest mapped fault systems had not produced significant historical seismicity and the induced events, while numerous and damaging remained below magnitude 6. In Texas, the situation is geologically different. The West Texas region contains fault systems of greater scale and complexity than Oklahoma's. The injection volumes are higher. The geographic extent of intense injection activity is larger, and the cumulative duration of high-volume injection, now spanning 15 plus years, is long enough that fluid migration has had time to reach fault structures at significant distances from individual well sites. Researchers studying the spatial and temporal patterns of Permian Basin seismicity have documented cases where earthquake clusters appear at locations kilometers away from the nearest high-volume disposal wells, suggesting that fluid migration through permeable pathways is extending the reach of injection-induced stress changes well beyond the immediate vicinity of individual operations. This is the dimension of the Texas-induced seismicity story that has not yet received the public attention it deserves. Individual earthquakes, even damaging ones, are recoverable events. Buildings can be repaired. Infrastructure can be restored. People can rebuild. The scenario that researchers are most concerned about is a cascading sequence in which induced seismicity on smaller fault structures transfers stress onto a larger, more capable fault and triggers a rupture that significantly exceeds anything the induced seismicity has produced so far. This scenario is not considered likely in any given year, but it is considered non-negligible over the cumulative time horizon of ongoing injection operations. The Ouachita structural belt, which underlies portions of the Permian Basin and extends across a broad swath of Texas, contains fault systems capable of producing earthquakes significantly larger than anything Texas has experienced in the modern induced seismicity era. Those systems have not moved in recorded human history, but they have not been subjected to the fluid pressures they are now being subjected to in recorded human history either. The scientific literature does not say these faults will rupture as a result of ongoing injection. It says the probability of their rupture is higher under current conditions than it was before large-scale injection began, and that the probability increases with continued injection. That is not a statement about inevitability. It is a statement about risk accumulation over time. The same kind of statement that actuaries make about any system being subjected to sustained stress beyond its historical experience. What you should do right now as a resident of Texas, or as a resident of any state with active disposal well operations, which includes Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, Ohio, Colorado, and others, begins with information. The USGS maintains a publicly accessible induced seismicity viewer that maps earthquake activity across the United States, alongside the locations of permitted disposal wells. Look at the map for your area. If you live or work near a cluster of recent seismic activity and you can see disposal wells in the same vicinity on the map, you're living in an area of elevated induced seismic risk. That information should inform how you think about the structural vulnerability of your building and how you prepare for the possibility of ground shaking. Secure heavy objects in your home, water heaters, bookshelves, cabinets, large appliances. Know where your gas shutoff is located and make sure you have the tool to operate it. Keep at minimum 72 hours of water and food accessible. These are the baseline preparations that every person in any seismically active area should have in place, and that most people in Texas have never thought about. Because the idea of an earthquake in Texas seemed absurd until recently, it is no longer absurd. The ground just moved, in a place that was never supposed to shake. The scientists monitoring the Texas seismic network tonight are not treating what just happened as a closed event. They are treating it as a data point in an ongoing sequence, and they are watching the surrounding fault network for signs of stress transfer and triggered seismicity in the hours and days ahead. The injection operations in the surrounding area continue to operate. The fluid continues to migrate. The pressure continues to build on fault segments that were never under this kind of stress before the modern era of industrial-scale wastewater disposal began, and the regulatory framework that governs those operations has not changed in response to what just happened. The same conditions that produced tonight's earthquake will be in place tomorrow morning and the morning after that, until something changes in how Texas regulates the industrial activity that has turned a seismically quiet state into one of the most earthquake-prone regions in the United States. The earthquakes will continue. The science on this point is not ambiguous. It is not contested. It is as clear as any finding in modern geophysics. What remains uncertain is not the science. What remains uncertain is the political will to act on it before the next earthquake. The larger one, the one the researchers are calculating the probability of right now, makes acting on it unavoidable. Stay with this channel. Because we are tracking every development in this story, And what the disposal well data shows building beneath the Permian Basin right now is something that every Texan needs to see.